Every engineer who worked on it signed their name inside it, not on a document, not in a file. On the inside of the mold, the tool that shaped the plastic housing, so that every Macintosh that came out of the factory in Fremont, California, carried the signatures of the people who built it pressed invisibly into the case. You couldn't see them once the machine was assembled, but they were there. That detail tells you something about what the people making the Macintosh believed they were doing. They didn't think they were assembling a computer. They thought they were making history. And in January 1984, when Steve Jobs pulled a beige computer out of a bag on a stage in Cupertino and had said hello to an audience that had never seen anything like it, they were right. This is what happened in the factory before that moment. The Macintosh was not the first personal computer. The Apple II had been selling since 1977. The IBM PC had arrived in 1981. There were computers in offices, in university labs, in the homes of the technically inclined. But they required something from their users, a willingness to learn commands, to type instructions, to navigate a system that rewarded expertise and punished ignorance. The Macintosh was designed from the beginning to require none of that. A mouse, a pointer, windows and icons that behaved like physical objects on a desk. The idea that a computer should understand how a human being already thinks, rather than requiring a human being to think like a computer. Jeff Raskin, a human interface researcher at Apple, had been developing this idea since 1979. Steve Jobs took it over, made it harder and better and more uncompromising, and drove it through 5 years of development that broke people and produced a machine unlike anything that had existed before. The factory that made it was in Fremont, in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. Apple called it the Macintosh Factory. It opened in January 1984, the same month the Macintosh was introduced. Jobs had designed it to be a showpiece, not a production floor, but a statement about what American manufacturing could look like. The walls were painted in Apple's colors, the floors were kept clean enough to eat from. Visitors were brought through on tours. The production equipment was arranged not purely for efficiency, but also for visual effect. Jobs believed that beautiful environments produced better work. Whether or not that was true, the factory was unlike any other consumer electronics production facility of the era. The Macintosh's plastic housing was injection molded in a distinctive off-white color that Apple called Pantone 453, a warm, slightly creamy white that was neither the institutional beige of IBM machines nor the bright white of medical equipment. It was a considered designed color. The molds that produced it were precision tools. The front bezel, the rear housing, the keyboard housing, each was a separate molding and each had to meet Apple's surface quality standards. A sync mark, a weld line, a variation in color from one batch to the next. Any of these was a rejection. Apple's industrial design team, led by Hartmut Esslinger's Frog Design Group, had defined the visual language of the machine down to the radius of every curve. The factory had to hold those radii. The main circuit board, the logic board, was assembled using automated insertion equipment and wave soldering. The Motorola 68000 processor ran at 8 MHz, 128 kilobytes of RAM, a 3.5-inch Sony floppy disk drive chosen over the then standard 5.25-inch format because Jobs wanted something that held more data and felt more premium. The choice of the Sony drive required Apple to redesign the software that talked to the disk controller, the mechanical interface that held the drive in the chassis, and the slot in the housing itself. Jobs made these decisions without asking whether they were convenient. The monitor was built into the machine. This was not standard. In 1984, a computer and its monitor were separate devices. You bought a box and a screen separately, connected them with a cable, and positioned them on your desk. The Macintosh was a single unit, monitor and computer in one housing, facing you directly, a face rather than an appliance. The 9-inch screen was a Sony Trinitron cathode ray tube, chosen for its clarity and its flat aperture grille design that reduced reflections. The CRT was mounted at the top of the housing behind a thick plastic bezel, with the disk drive and the logic board occupying the space below. The assembly sequence required workers to build the machine from the inside out. The CRT was installed first, lowered into the housing through the top opening before the other components were in place. It was heavy, fragile, and carried lethal voltages in the flyback transformer circuit even when unpowered. Workers handling the CRT wore insulating gloves. They followed a specific sequence. The high voltage circuit had to be discharged before any work near the tube. There was a procedure. The procedure was followed every time. After the CRT, the analog board, the power supply and video circuits, was installed against the left side of the housing. Then the logic board slid into the base of the chassis on rails. Then the floppy drive, seated in its bay and connected with a ribbon cable. Then the outer housing lowered over the assembled internals and fastened with screws. 5 screws, Torx T15 fasteners, recessed into positions that required a special tool to reach, a tool Apple did not include in the box and did not sell in their stores. This was intentional. The Macintosh was not designed to be repaired by its owner. It was designed to be used. At the end of the assembly line, each Macintosh went to the burn-in station. Burn-in was a process in which the completed machine was powered on and run continuously for a defined period, typically 48 hours, under conditions of elevated temperature. The theory behind burn-in was that components which were going to fail due to manufacturing defects would fail quickly under stress. Better they fail in the factory under controlled conditions than in a customer's home during the first week of use. The burn-in room at the Fremont facility was a hot room, racks of powered-on Macintoshes running test software, the collective heat of hundreds of machines raising the temperature to a level that accelerated any latent failure. Workers monitored the burn-in racks. A machine that crashed during burn-in came off the rack, went to the rework bench, was diagnosed, repaired, and put back on for another burn-in cycle. A machine that survived 48 hours of burn-in was considered proven. Jobs visited the factory regularly. He walked the floor, he asked questions, he noticed things. When he discovered that one of the production machines had a scratch on its surface that wasn't visible in normal light, but caught the light at certain angles, he stopped the line. The mold was examined. A burr in the mold cavity was found and polished out. The line restarted. The workers who built the first Macintosh remember this, not as a management style they endured, but as evidence that what they were making mattered. Every detail mattered. That was the message the factory sent to the people working in it. In the first 100 days of production, the Fremont factory made 50,000 Macintoshes. By the end of 1984, that number was approaching 250,000. The signatures inside the mold were producing machines at a rate that put them in the hands of writers and designers and musicians and students who would spend the next 40 years insisting that their computer was not just a tool. It was the one made by people who signed their names to it. The Fremont factory closed in 1992. Apple moved production to Singapore, then to contract manufacturers in Asia, then ultimately to Foxconn in China, where the iPhone and the MacBook and everything that followed would be assembled. The building in Fremont was demolished. The molds with the signatures inside them were discarded or melted down. What survived was the machine, and the idea that the people who built it had pressed into it along with their names. That a computer could be personal, not in the sense of belonging to one person, in the sense of having been made by people who believed in what they were building. The signatures are gone. The belief is what remained.